everybody. We're gonna do chapter 16 here. It's an intense one. So I don't love that it is a virtual lecture, but still super, super important. We are now entering basically the unit before the Civil War, and then it'll lead into the Civil War. And so you're going to see a lot of different causes, and that's ultimately one of the big questions is they want you to know is, can you talk about different causes and different sparks along the way that led to the Civil War? Okay, so this is called the South and the Slavery Controversy. And we've obviously talked about slavery. This is going to give a little bit more specific focus on it in the 1800s. Okay, so cotton is king. What does that mean? You see this is a pretty famous Poco cartoon right here. Old England is mighty, old England is free. She boasts that she ruleth the ways of the sea. But between you and I, that's all fiddle-dee-dee. She cannot, O cotton, she cannot rule thee. What does that mean? You can keep reading there. But so basically, because of the cotton gin, cotton is really going to take off and become the number one crop in the South. It's going to surpass tobacco and rice and sugar, and largely because of that. Okay, it becomes half of American exports. Isn't that crazy? Think about that for a second. If one product nowadays was half of American exports, that's not a good thing. Anytime you rely on one export or one crop or anything, it can be really dangerous. Look at this. America's cotton supplied half of the world's supply. So it truly was thriving. And as you know, the textile machines are getting going and using this cotton. And I do want to say this specifically when I talk about the world. One of the biggest importers was Britain. And that is going to be, I want you to put that in the back of your mind because we're going to come back to that when we think about why did the South feel so confident that they could beat the North? Well, one of the reasons is that the South knew that Britain particularly was so invested with cotton that they thought that, oh, Britain will come support us, right? They'll come over here. If we do end up going to war, we'll have them help us. Now, so if we talk about cotton and the huge production of it, who's going to benefit the most? And it's the planter aristocrats. And as we've said before, they are the social, political, economic leaders in the South, right? And so we've seen that disparity between the large planters, and then we'll talk later about the smaller ones. And then we kind of just mentioned this too, but the thing with if you just plant one crop over and over and over again, that actually is really difficult for the soil. If you remember back when we talked about three sisters, right? Those three help renew the soil. And then you also have that slash and burn farming as well. But here, so land was pretty much butchered, and you're going to see people had to keep moving west and keep moving west, like southwest, in order to get more agricultural land for cotton. And so it becomes a one crop economy. And I don't know about you, but I was told early on with my finances, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, right? Let's say if you have lots of stock and you put it all in apple, that's pretty dangerous because if something goes wrong with that, which with agriculture that can easily happen, right? Then your whole finances are going down. Now, one thing about all this cotton and especially with slavery being the number one labor source, it's going to really repel a lot of immigrants to the South for lots of different reasons. One is they don't know how to plant cotton. That's not something they came over with. One is it's really difficult to get a job here because of the competition of slavery. So what you're going to see in the South really is going to lack diversity. They're going to have the largest white population compared to other regions in the United States. And that is because of cotton, because of slavery, and how that repelled diversity. Let's look at that real quick. If you can kind of look at this chart for a second, one thing you should notice is that it's starting from the top, it's going to get larger here. So this is a huge, I don't think myth is the right word. I think misconception might be the better word. Only a fourth of white Southerners owned slaves. I feel like people misunderstand and think that, oh my gosh, everybody owned slaves in the South. That's actually, look at that, only about 25% of them owned slaves. So the majority did not. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But now if you look at large slave owners, that I'm sure you've kind of, again, have this like prototypical example of these huge plantations. That's also a very small group. So you can kind of see here with the huge 100 or more slaves, that's very rare. They also were very rich. Then you get small slave owners, and this is going to be kind of the more common route for slave owners because it's an expensive and difficult process. A lot of times these small slave owners are going to be working alongside their slaves, kind of doing the agricultural work with them. But yeah, most owned, if you think about most slave owners, it's not that large group. Most slave owners actually own 10 or less. And you can even look down here as we get bigger, down here. Okay, so again, I think that's another misconception. Then you get another group. So this is if you do your math here, 75% of white Southerners don't own slaves. Well, then how was slavery such a popular thing if it was kind of a minority movement here? And here's the reason, is that although this group here is the majority, their goal is to own slaves one day. They support the whole system because that's their dream, is to be rich enough to have your own land, to have your own slaves. So I think that's racism is kind of embedded in there. So yeah, the American dream, and then also I put racial superiority. This idea of, okay, well, I don't own slaves, but at least I'm not the bottom of the barrel. At least I'm better than somebody. I think that mindset was there as well. Okay. Then you get this other group. They call them the mountain whites, hillbillies. That's kind of where you hear this. These were ones that were living, in like the Appalachian Mountains, truly backcountry. They didn't have a whole lot of interaction outside their area. They weren't really taught to read or write. They're mostly subsistence farmers. You hear that word subsistence, it means that you farm enough, you make enough to support your own family. Maybe a little bit to trade something else, but for the most part, you're just making enough to survive. Okay, but I want you to know this. We're gonna come back to this group later because they are actually, when the Civil War starts, they're gonna support the Union. They're not gonna support the Confederacy. And why is that? They think it's because they were so isolated, they kind of felt bitterness towards that rich elite, those large slave owners, and so maybe it wasn't like hey, racism didn't exist for that. That's not true. It was more of they felt bitterness towards the other group, and they were so separate. So let's remember that. Okay. So I want you to look at this map. This is 1820. This is our Missouri Compromise time. And you can kind of look over here. It talks about in the key the percentage of slaves and total population. You see some red areas up here and here in South Carolina and Georgia, a little bit Louisiana. Okay, watch this though. This is 18. I can see it on there. 1860, right before the start of the Civil War. Now, what do you notice the big differences? Right now, slavery, cotton has really expanded down here. And they're going to call this the Black Belts because of that high population of slaves coming down here. This is that deep South. Which, if you fast forward later on, when it gets to the Civil Rights Unit, this is the unit, or this is the region that struggles the most with civil rights. One other thing that's mentioned at this time is the Mason-Dixon line. Have you guys heard of that before? The Mason-Dixon line originally was drawn to help actually settle some borders between states, like Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware. But it became this basically idea of the North versus the South, the supporting slavery versus not supporting slavery. And so, if you ever hear that, the Mason-Dixon line, that's kind of where it comes from. Okay. One group we did not talk about in the South and in the North were free blacks. And there's a couple different reasons why they might have gotten their freedom. Some of it came after the American Revolution, because if you think about the American Revolution and the Constitution, these ideas of liberty and every man is created equal, right? Those ideas kind of spurred some emancipation at that time. Um, some mulattoes, so I'm trying to think, I don't think we've talked about this term. Mulattoes, this is a mixed race group between black slaves and usually their white masters. Obviously, that was not by choice. And so you get this new race here, and sometimes they were freed. Oftentimes they were not. Oftentimes they were kept in chains, and that was almost a goal, was to produce more slaves from some of those slave owners. Okay. And then another group, you do see some were able to purchase freedom, and their masters, their owners allowed that. But overall, they lived a tough life, and depending on where they were in the North or South, but either place, they weren't popular. And we're going to talk more about that in the North later on. Racism still existed in the North, although abolition isn't going to rise there. There's still racism, that we talked about, that superiority. There's still competition for jobs, and so you're going to see these freed blacks have a difficult time. Even though they were free, depending on where they lived too, most they were not. They couldn't vote. We know that. They couldn't go to school. Slowly, you'll see a couple schools open up later on, but um, this right here, we're going to talk about Frederick Douglass in a minute. This says, knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave, which is why a lot of masters didn't want to educate their slaves. They were scared of that knowledge that they would gain. Okay, so I think we've talked a little bit about plantation slavery. By 1860, the outbreak of the Civil War, you have 4 million black slaves in the South. 4 million. Now, I don't know if we've officially given you a date here. In the United States, the international slave trade was abolished in 1808. The international slave trade. Now, that does not mean that internal slavery was abandoned, because that's not true. But that means like getting slaves from other countries, from Africa, brought over. 1808. I would tell you that is a date to know. Um, Now, if you know about the Civil War, the time period, I'll make you learn that later. But that's not until really 1865, towards the end, right? When slavery, when emancipation happens, um, or when the 13th Amendment happens. But so 1808 all the way to 1865. It's a long time, right? For them to kind of know something was wrong with it, but they don't want to ban it all. It did lead to like smuggling still, you're still going to see people try to bring international slaves over. Now, one of the awful, awful parts about slavery or slave auctions. I think we've talked a little bit about this, but you'll see in some of those port cities, they'll have those big auctions where you essentially where people came and just like livestock would check out their physical structure, their fertility for women, their teeth. They would check their back to see if there were already whippings on it, because that would demonstrate whether or not someone was a rebellious slave. It's pretty awful, terrible parts to kind of human history here. One of the worst parts about it, and I have this video that I'll show you next time, is in these slave auctions. What one of the most terrible aspects of it, and this video shows it, is just like the breaking up of families. And how you'll see this mom, it's a reenactment, but this mom loses both of her kids. And now, personally, as a mom now, I can't imagine that. So that's definitely one of the terrible, awful, one of all of it's terrible, but probably the most emotional parts there of this life. Now it is fair to say that different plantations treated slaves differently. You would have some masters be more empathetic is not the right word. See them a little bit more as family and treat them nicer. However, they're still not allowed to leave, right? So that always exists. But some would bring in like I don't really serious whipping breakers. I don't know if you know what a breaker is. Masters would often bring in this terrible kind of person to come in and break the spirit of really rebellious and stubborn slaves to the point of, who knows. Now, that being said, a master would not want to injure his slave too much because that is a huge investment of their money. Now, this is one to note here. How American slavery differed than the rest of the world was that even after the slave trade was abolished, so they're not getting new slaves internationally, the population still rose. And why? Is because of natural reproduction on these plantations. And that's a unique aspect of American slavery. And it just demonstrates, especially on some of the larger ones of 20 or more, that slaves did have a culture and families, and oftentimes that gave them the only community that they had. Religion became religion became a huge part of plantation life for many slaves, and we're going to talk about this after emancipation as well. But it became a unique mix of this Christianity from America, kind of combined with some African elements. For example, I don't know if you know anything about like response preaching, where the pastor says something and the congregation says it back or says something else back. That is a uniquely religious aspect of many slave cultures at that time. Okay, so rebellion. Why didn't it happen more? Right? If you have this population numerical advantage of slaves versus their masters, why? And I talk about that on here. You can a couple different reasons is one, it was difficult to organize because they couldn't read and they couldn't write, and that was on purpose to make any kind of uprising difficult. Also, if you talk about technology and guns, and that was a big fear component for sure. the ways that they rebelled the most would have been working really slowly, um, fast enough to where they maybe wouldn't get in too much trouble, but slow enough to where it would kind of punish the master, the slave owner. They would also sabotage equipment, sometimes even, you know, poison food, that kind of thing. You do see occasionally a runaway slave, and I know that's pretty uh, vivid maybe in some memories, but that honestly didn't happen a lot because of how difficult it was and dangerous. Um, One of the biggest rebellions, though, was Nat Turner, and this is in Virginia. Um, and if you can see, it this was a slave rebellion where Nat Turner organized this massacre of 60 whites, and many of them were women and children. And so, if you look at this document here, you can kind of tell the point of view. Right? It's obviously a white person. Um, but because of this, it led to actually more fear and tighter holds and tighter kind of rules for slaves. One other famous rebellion, I don't know if you've heard of Amistad. This is actually a movie, a pretty powerful movie. It's hard to watch. Um, it's about a Spanish slave ship around Cuba, and the slaves actually overtake the Spanish traders here, and eventually steer the ship all the way to Long Island. And then basically it becomes this kind of a court case of what do we do with these Africans, and eventually they're released to West Africa. But that's definitely one of the most famous rebellions there. Okay, so what did abolition look like? Some different thoughts and some different strategies. American Colonization Society. Okay, so this is 1817. It's not a date for you to know, but if you think about time of that, um, this is an interesting idea. Their belief was to send blacks back to Africa, and they created actually a new country, Liberia. Heard of Liberia? What's the root word there? It's liberty. Liberty. Liberty means freedom. So they actually established this new country specifically for sending blacks back there. Now, something's wrong with that, though. There is, maybe it comes from a good heart or something, but actually, there is a little bit of racism there because the idea is, well, we don't want them here. Um, Especially a lot of, I mean, these slaves, if you think now by 1817, they have lived here for 100, 200 years, depending, over 100 years, and they are American now. They don't really feel a lot of cultural ties themselves, language, all that stuff, to Africa anymore. So it's kind of a weird idea. Even Lincoln originally believed in this. Um, just so you know, 15,000 slaves were eventually transported back to Liberia. We already talked about this, the Great Awakening. Obviously, the Great Awakening and the religious movement that happened spurred on abolitionism, right? Used the Bible to argue that slavery was not okay. And it really, really sparked abolitionism even stronger. And so now you get a couple different ideas here as well. William Lloyd Garrison is known for writing the Liberator newspaper. And kind of just looking at that picture down there, what do you think his goal was based on the name as well? The Liberator. He wanted immediate emancipation. Like we're doing this now. We're not waiting. We need to do this. And that scared a lot of people, even a lot of whites in the North that scared. They weren't ready for something drastic and huge change. And we'll talk kind of about the beliefs that they had. Sorry, go back. Another group, the American Anti-Slavery Society. This is just an abolitionist society. This is not one that I don't think you'll be asked about. Eventually, it did have about 250,000 members. Appeal to the colored citizens of the world. This is actually a pretty violent overthrow of slavery. Like, we need to fight back now. It was by a former slave, and that was the goal: is this violent overthrow of slavery. Again, if you look at 1829, the country's not there yet. And then probably the most famous here, if you've heard of Frederick Douglass, he wrote this autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, excuse me. Very vivid, really brought a lot of his stories to life. He was a freed black. He taught himself how to read and write. He escaped at, I think, age 21 and wrote this and really was able to show some of the horrors of slavery. He went around talking to increase the abolitionist movement. Okay, so what is the South saying at this point, right? What is their argument here? Um, well, one of the big kind of momentous occasions was 1831 when it came to Virginia, to their legislator, whether or not they should emancipate their slaves officially, and they defeated it. And if you know Virginia, right, it's this powerful state. They defeated emancipation. It's almost like all the other states felt more boldened, more strengthened in their desire to keep slavery as well. We talked about the nullification crisis, right, with Jackson. And that, if you remember that again, that's over what? The tariff, right? And so that idea, the fact that they were so stubborn, I'll just say that, strong willed about the tariff, again, I think emboldened them and made them ready to fight early on, even though it was a different topic. Now, what are their arguments here, right? Why keep slavery? Obviously, it's the huge economic component, right? That the world relies on it. The North actually relies on us. I'll talk about that in a second. But some of their other arguments that they twisted and made sense in their mind. One, they say, look, slavery's in the Bible. It says obey your master in the Bible. And so, telling slaves that in their mind was true. They also believe that they were civilizing a lot of these slaves. They were, they were truly giving them Christian doctrine and teaching them Christianity along the ways. Here's a big one. They believe that if you compare a slave in the South to a northern factory worker, right, maybe super low income immigrant, and they basically say, look, you guys have you have slaves too. They don't get paid much. They have terrible working conditions. Look at our slaves. They work outside. We feed them, we treat them, we house them. We essentially treat our slaves better than your workers. And then kind of the last argument is that family dynamic. Like, look, these slaves are a part of our life, right? That we have this close bond and close relationship with them, and we treat them like family. And maybe some of them did treat them semi like family, but at the end of the day, they were still a slave. So anyway, those are some of the arguments. Well, in 1836, the House of Representatives passes this. It's called the Gag Resolution. And essentially, they were seeing so many arguments kind of come up against slavery, and finally, they just said, we're cutting it. No more. No more talk about abolitionism. And they passed this. It really did prohibit debate or arguments about slavery. Sounds like a First Amendment issue. And it really kept down, this is the House of Representatives, it kept down the talk of slavery for a long time. 8 years, by the way. 8 years is how often it got, how long it was John Quincy Adams. Another group, the postmasters, people getting mail, they were told to burn abolition material. If it's reading material, if it's pictures, they thought it would be very dangerous for slaves to see. And so, again, this is kind of a question of whether or not this is actually democracy here. The North. So we obviously have talked about abolition and rising, and it was, but you're still gonna see a lot of fear in the North. They have a huge economic stake. Really, a lot of these farmers in the South took out loans from northern banks. So if they fail, then the banks fail, right? And so that's kind of this weird economic stake there that they have. Also, if you think about cotton, cotton was sent to the north, right, to make textiles. Again, you see that economic component there of the relationship between the north and the south, and they needed cotton, and they were scared of what would happen if slavery ended. Also, you could add in here the potential fear of Britain. Maybe not as much as the South wanted them to fear, but you could put it in there. You had strong abolitionists get persecuted when they spoke out, and so that scared others and kept them more timid about it. Then you're going to get this this is where they decide to go here is okay, maybe let's not get rid of slavery. All right, maybe that should not be our goal. But maybe we should kind of in the future say no slavery can come into new lands. So basically, no expansion of slavery. So you're going to see that, and you're going to see a couple different political parties come up to try and battle this and what their position is. So, all right. All right, that's it. An interesting, a sad, complex kind of chapter here.